Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ted, and thanks to everyone who's here today. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this really important workshop. It's a pleasure to be involved in this conversation. And I look forward to hearing from all of you. I know this is a very interdisciplinary effort, and I'm really interested that we can have a deep conversation about this. So I'm going to talk today about science, communication, and society. First, in terms of, excuse me, trying to unpack and understand what we as scholars truly mean when we talk about science communication, looking at the development of the field, the definitions, the boundaries, what we conceptualize it as, what we don't include in that, and then sort of move on from there to where do we go from here as researchers, educators, professionals, to better understand the societies we live in and engage with them, particularly in this age of accelerating climate change. So how can we better prepare our students going into 21st century newsrooms and media industries to understand challenges and opportunities, talking about flooding and other climate change related impacts? How do we do better when studying flooding, creating research designs that include deeper and more critical analysis of all variables, or as many as we can get to ultimately really move the needle and make a difference? So with that, let's talk about science communication. So what is it? What does it mean? How do we understand it? And, you know, I suppose if you asked 100 people what science communication means to them, you'd probably get 100 different answers. And that includes if you asked 100 faculty members from various disciplines. Perhaps there are some who might conceptualize it only in applied or professional terms. We might receive a number of answers such as science communication is climate change news, it's advocating to save the rainforests, it's teaching scientists how to speak with the general public, it's teaching people how to write press releases or shoot video, or that it's the study of information about science, scientific issues, and related affairs. So we've seen the historical development of science communication as sort of a more narrowly defined field, like a linear form of communication between those in authority to represent science, handing down information to those who lack that information. And this includes public relations efforts too, from authoritative scientific actors and institutions. And from that, we had something that was developed that we now know as the deficit model, where this idea of people are lacking information, all you have to do is hand them the information, and then behaviors and perceptions would change, which we all know is not the case, right? And then over time, as science communication became a bounded field of inquiry, we became more interested in the science of science communication. So here's this definition from National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. When it comes to communicating information about our discoveries, why do we so often use intuition instead of science? Communicating about science effectively with public audiences, however, turns out to be more difficult than it might at first appear. People communicate about science for diverse reasons. There is no single audience for scientific information, and the societal context surrounding different scientific issues can vary considerably. We also have definitions that emphasize empiricism, right? So by the science of science communication, we mean an empirical approach to defining and understanding audiences, designing this over here, messages, mapping communication landscapes, and most important, evaluating the effectiveness of communication efforts. The science communication environment is the interaction of processes and cues that citizens, organizations, governments, and a host of other stakeholders use to identify valid science and align it with their value systems, understanding of the world, and ultimately decisions. Over time, we move from the deficit model, to more of an engagement perspective, right? So citizens are active science communication consumers, know how to negotiate media platforms and decision-making spheres. It's a dynamic exchange, not a one or two-way flow. So the science of science communication also now importantly includes critical examinations of science as an institution with questions of culture, of power, values, identity, representation, social construction, historical development, although there's far more to be done here, which I will touch on later. And when we talk about science communication, what do we mean by science, right? What's included? Is it just scientific discovery? What subfields are viewed as part of science communication? What are our academic understandings that can lead to siloing, being involved in different disciplines, established fields? So science communication has key overlaps with other communication disciplines such as environmental communication, health communication, public communication of science and technology. These historical differences in environmental communication, for example, and science communication are particularly interesting to me. I work a lot in environmental communication, but I'm part of a science communication program that also includes health communication experts and those who work in communicating about technology as well. So environmental communication emerged in part as a critique of science or of the science industry technology nexus, where science communication was seen as more focused on public scientific literacy and strategies to increase literacy levels. However, to what degree are these divisions academic exercises? A significant amount of science communication looks at environmental themes, and environmental communication is also interested in aspects of contested science, the promotion of science, scientific awareness and literacy. So some argue that environmental communication, for example, is more of a close cousin with political communication and a distant relative of science communication. But we should ask, what are these layers involved with science, scientific issues, expertise, and authority? How do politics, values, and activism enter into these discussions? And let's not forget the interdisciplinary nature of communication itself as a bounded field of study. Its growth, the research that draws from linguistics, psychology, sociology, and other disciplines. There's a lot we can learn from one another. And these historical academic delineations and siloing perhaps also need re-examination in an age of interdisciplinary collaborations that we have to have in order to tackle the wicked problems we all face. So those working in science communication would do well to examine how their own work relates to other fields. And all of this to say there's been an explosion in interest in science communication, environmental communication, health communication, et cetera. For the purpose of this, I'm going to kind of fold those all into science communication. We see a lot of centers, initiatives, programs. Penn State, where I am, has a science communication program in the college, Belisario College of Communications, Yale, University of Pennsylvania, George Mason, University of Wisconsin at Madison. There's also a number of degree programs, writing, journalism, certificates. So UC Santa Cruz has one of the oldest science writing programs, UC San Diego, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Maryland, NYU, Columbia. And this is not at all an exhaustive list. These are some of the more well-known ones, UC Boulder and Michigan State. We also have programs that focus on training, media training. So whether that's, scientists speaking with the media or scientists speaking with the public, the Alan Alda Center, Compass, AAAS, engagement and outreach. The Citizen Science Association is a great association if anyone has worked with them before, also portal to the public. So a lot of resources, a lot of interest, a lot of people going into these programs because they care about science communication. So what is going on? What is happening in the world around us? In my country, we are in an age of mis and disinformation that has such real significance for so many people. So for example, there was a recent Yahoo News YouGov poll that found that 44% of Republicans believe that Bill Gates is plotting to use a mass COVID-19 vaccination campaign in order to implement microchips in billions of people and track their movement, right? And this is just one example of what happens when authority of science is questioned and the facts are questioned, and the mediated information transmission and translation isn't necessarily in the way we thought it would be. So we have a real problem with how the public understands science, views the legitimacy of scientific institutions and actors, and the degree to which this politicization of science has shown up in so many ways in mediated content. So I like this quote: "Never have human societies known so much about mitigating the dangers they face, but agreed so little about what they collectively know. Because this disjunction features the persistence of divisive conflict in the face of compelling scientific evidence, we can refer to it as the science communication paradox." And this politicization of science impacts so many lives in so many ways, right? From our understanding of climate change, its causes and implications, willingness to vaccinate children, our perceptions of vulnerability to flood risk, the understanding of responsibility and accountability, and the role of different stakeholders. These all have serious and lasting societal repercussions. So when we're looking at flooding, and this is a photo from a friend of mine in Miami, this was taken over Memorial Day weekend. South Florida had historic record-setting rainfall that I didn't see got too much coverage outside of the South Florida region. And it was not only the levels of precipitation that fell were record-setting, but also the groundwater levels were so high because of previous rainfall that it just caused enormous flooding. So this is a photo of her front yard. She does not have waterfront property, but it certainly looked so in this case. And we see how flooding too often is covered in event-centered ways, right? When there's a crisis, we talk about flooding, we talk about it in certain ways, and then once the waters recede, we don't talk about it anymore. And so it leads me, as someone, you know, I lived in Miami for 20 years, has the world just accepted that Miami floods? So it's not getting national coverage, it's not getting international coverage. Do we just decide that it's flooding today, it's probably going to flood tomorrow, and that's what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about the event. When do we start talking about why neighborhoods flood, right? Public policy, construction, insurance programs, inequalities, risk, blame, geography, behavior, resiliency, response, expertise, authority. These are all important questions to ask. This is a screen grab from a local television post on social media where they went into an apartment complex in Overtown, which is a historic neighborhood in Miami. In this particular complex, the reporter was sharing that a lot of disabled people live, and this was after the storm system had passed, but standing water was about a foot or more in the hallways. And when you went into the apartments, even though they had done their best to sandbag it, the apartments were filled with water too. So when do we start talking about social vulnerability, right? When we're talking about flooding and climate change, when we move beyond the risk of the hazard. We move beyond the risk of the hazard, we move beyond the hazard itself, right? Your yard floods because of coastal erosion. But when do we start talking about the underlying social conditions, the systemic political and economic inequality, the structural racism, uneven access to services, to healthcare, poorly maintained infrastructure, right? The drainage is not good, water doesn't flow the way it should, and nothing's getting fixed. Limited access to services and parks, and all of these different things that go into when, how, and why a certain geography may flood. And the language that we use is also really important. This is a good article by Rich Olson. Please don't call them natural disasters. The reality is that exposures to hazards are increasing and climate change will give us more extreme weather events. We know that irrational land use policies, non-compliance with building codes, poor governance, and bad planning in general work together to put more assets and people in harm's way. Hurricane Harvey, for example, demonstrated the folly of unrestrained and unsustainable urban sprawl in a region prone to severe flooding. Problem is that the term natural disaster, which often puts a slight and too politically convenient emphasis on the word natural, blurs the causal picture in the public mind and subtly shifts responsibility for disaster losses away from their root cause. This blurring is particularly relevant to land use and building standard decisions, which are overwhelmingly political and largely determine loss patterns and levels. So, how do we understand our own vulnerabilities? How are we being told in certain ways by media, repeating words from others, that the accountability and the responsibility is ours and ours alone. It's individualized, right? It's shifted to the individual, and the responsibility of the state or the private sector is really minimized. And when this is repeated and amplified over time, how much do we start to internalize this, particularly when we're thinking about issues related to environmental justice or injustice, as we know that minority and lower income communities often face this so-called double jeopardy when it comes to environmental crises and threats, more exposed to the environmental hazards, but also more sensitive to that exposure because of these systemic social inequalities. So when we are thinking about all of these issues, about communicating science, about communicating environmental issues, when we talk about health, when we talk about technology, how do we better engage our communities and one another around these issues? I'm coming now from an academic perspective, so when we're talking about putting together research projects and research designs, how often do we let the siloing, the disciplinary divides, or the differential methodological approaches that we have stop us from really creating meaningful projects, right? How often have any of us had a particular question or an idea for a hypothesis that we've had where we just thought, you know, I don't have the expertise, I wouldn't know how to put that together. I don't know that this person would want to work with me because it might not make sense based on, you know, the bureaucracy of where we work. But it's time to, and I know we all know this, but I just want to reinforce it, cross those aisles. We have wicked problems that we really urgently need to work on. And it shouldn't be the siloing or these different perceptions of the divides that we have, or you know, a sense that it wouldn't work out if we put together a team from people from different disciplines to tackle them. So that's really important. And I think for something, and obviously you guys know this too, because you're all here, something like flooding, we need to bring in people from all over, right? So the political sciences, the economic sciences, the emergency managers, communication studies, journalism professors, data science, information technology, all these different areas of expertise to really have something meaningful, a meaningful collaboration. How can we better educate our students? So for those of you who teach, how often do we still have the deficit model mentality in our classrooms? You know, subconsciously thinking, well, these students are coming into the classroom at the beginning of the semester, I'm going to give them the information, and at the end of the semester, they're going to have it and go out in the world and do great things. It's more necessary than ever that we engage our students, we engage our communities, we provide this interactivity with global publics. Ted and I have talked about this a lot, how important it is that you're teaching a skills class, does that necessarily mean you can only teach them the professional skills, right? What about all that research, everything that we've understood that can infuse that class and take it to a different place, make it a deeper exploration of these critical issues? And the skills too. I teach various classes ranging from skills to the more theoretical discussions of science communication, but the students want to learn the skills in that too. They want to talk about, writing leads. They want to talk about, how you put that video together. So how can we bring in these different attributes into the classes that we teach? And then to reinforce again, the importance of having critical and multi-layered approaches that focus on inclusivity and bring in the idea of intersectionality, right? So how these social categorizations of an individual, like race, class, and gender, create systemic discrimination, and how have these historically been created, maintained? How might they be reflected in the information flows and industries from which we receive our information about the world? We must acknowledge the assumptions of power and authority from these institutions and the actors in science and in information industries, and do better to address those critically. We also need to reflect on our and others' explicit and implicit biases and assumptions that impact how we examine the world and how we communicate with others. So here I am drawing from this great article, Canfield, down here, where they talk about inclusive science communication, and as well as, bridging these methodological divides, the Lewis et al. Article that just came out, using qualitative approaches to improve quantitative inferences in environmental psychology. So with that, how am I doing on time? Oh, good. I had promised Ted that I would leave time for questions.